As a trauma survivor, I have always been interested in resilience. But growing up, I believed it was something that you were born with. Then in graduate school, I learned that it was a quality that we all possess and a set of skills we can all strengthen. Most of my resilience has come from writing and seeing myself in new ways by confronting the stories I've always told myself. The more I did that, the stronger I became, and I've dedicated my life to helping others do this work. This podcast is for anyone who wants to understand their story and how to revise it, because when we do that work, we change the world. Most people expect their siblings to age alongside them, but what happens when death cuts that relationship short? How do you live with this grief that until recently went largely unacknowledged? Join Alyson Shelton, Lynn Shattuck, and I as we kick off Worldwide Bereaved Sibling Month with a roundtable discussion about sibling loss, the challenges of living with disenfranchised grief, and how writing has helped us heal and maintain a relationship with our siblings, even though they're gone, on this week's episode of the Writing and Resilience podcast. Let's dive in. Well, hello, Lynn and Alyson. Welcome to the Writing Your Resilience podcast. I am so just honored and happy to have you on today.
Well, thank you for having us. I'm thrilled to be sitting down and talking with the two of you.
We are meeting for a very important and auspicious occasion. This is the launch for Sibling Loss Month, which will start in November, and this is actually airing on October 31st, so the day before. So we're going to take time today to honor something that most people experience alone, which is sibling loss and sibling loss grief. So to begin, we're going to start with a ritual that we all came up with. And so the first thing we're going to do is we all have a candle. So hold up your candle for those watching on YouTube.
I don't have
You can hold it up like this. You have a mental candle. That's what you have.
I do.
And that's great. So if you're listening, you can have your mental candle too, right? So we have our candles. I'm going to light mine. And Lynn, you're lighting it in your imagination. And so I'm going to use my waterproof matches that take a bunch of times. And we're just going to take a moment to share our sibling's name. And I'll begin. Joe Cooper. He was 20 years old and he died in 1997. And Lynn, you may go next.
Sure. I'm lighting this handle for my brother, Will Shattuck. He died in 1999 at the age of 21.
I'm holding this candle for my brother, Michael, who died in 1984. And I've written places that he was 26, but he was 25. He hadn't reached his 26th birthday, which I think speaks to something I'll probably talk about later about how my grief has changed over time. So I'm just happy to be here and taking space and acknowledging all of them, all of our brothers.
Well, I am grateful that you're both here to talk about this really important issue because, as I said earlier, most people experience sibling loss alone, and it is something that has not really been acknowledged in our society, even though it's one of the most common losses that people face. And a commonality for all of us, we were at different ages when we lost our siblings, but all of our siblings were in their 20s, a time, it's considered to be very young to die. It's an unexpected death. And so for many people, if you're listening, it doesn't really matter how your sibling dies. Grief is grief, but sometimes grief gets interpreted in different ways based on the age someone is. And I think sometimes that's a little unfair because you could be in your 50s and 60s and you lose your sibling. And sometimes those are the least acknowledged because it's expected. It's more normalized. Like, oh, of course you're going to lose your sibling at that age. Doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. So I want to ask you each to share one word that you would use to talk about grief, and then tell me how you both met.
My word is lonely, which you alluded to earlier. Yeah.
I would say hidden.
Mm.
So Lynn and I were connected through social media during the pandemic. And so I was reading some of her writing, and a lot of it is about Will. And Lynn wrote about things that I felt like, oh, wow, me too. And these feelings that I had buried, really. I didn't feel like there was a lot of space for my grief beyond probably like a week, a month, not a very long time. And so, and for any of our grief,
Yeah.
like it just wasn't part of the conversation. There was a lot going on in our family. And I think I felt like it was another thing that I couldn't let go of. I think that was very much the role in my family, was the person who's like a dog with a bone, you can't let anything go. And so that was just in that container of things I couldn't let go. And then when I started reading Lynn's writing, it was so validating, because I felt like it's okay to not let it go.
Yes.
It's okay to still grieve the life that we weren't able to share with each other, and to consider how different my life would be if he were still here. He's still in my life. I still have a relationship with him, but it's very different than if he were alive. And Lynn's writing opened up a door to considering all of this, and helping me make a space for grief that I was mostly either in denial about or feeling shameful about. So that's why I think I just like saying I've written that he was 26. Like, to me, what I remembered was that I was 10, and it was December of 1984, but we didn't talk about the details very much, it just wasn't something we engaged with.
Yeah. And when it's silenced, it creates the situation where you feel like you have to keep it silent. And I think that buries it further.
Definitely. And I felt like in the hierarchy of grief, which is something we've all talked about in different calls, obviously siblings are very low on the hierarchy of
Yes.
grief, but also I was, in my family of 5 children, the only half sibling, and the youngest and the only girl. So I was like in the basement of the hierarchy
Yeah.
of grief. So even if I wanted to begin to articulate what I was feeling, I felt like I was really quickly shut down with like, he's your half brother. You've got more brothers. What does it really even mean to you anyway? Even though, I was raised with him, I never really thought about him being my half brother. The word really came to take on a lot of meaning after he died. It was the moment in my life where I realized I was other in my family very clearly, not just because I was a girl, because that was true, but also because I was the half one.
Yeah.
And so it was also, I think, all of the grief wrapped up with that, like how, and being 10 and you're beginning to separate from your family anyway. And it was just a real watershed moment. And I don't think I could really unpack and understand all of that at 10. So I just put it away.
Yeah. I mean, at 10 years old, you are just at the point where you are able to conceive of what death really is. I mean, developmentally, but how you wrap your mind around it, we don't have those capacities. And then if there's no one is holding space for it and you're feeling othered, that just compounds things. And, you talked about that hierarchy of grief and how, we are at various rungs, siblings are low. And then for all of the reasons that you mentioned, you felt like you were in the basement, like maybe even not on the ladder, kind of keep digging down. And that's where I am.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so the farther you are from, the ladder, let alone the top of the ladder, the more you're experiencing what we might call disenfranchised grief. And so, Lynn, you and I met because we both share sibling loss, and I've got to learn so much about Will, and that's been wonderful. And you are on a mission to make us not feel alone, which is one of the things I love about you. So can you tell us a little bit about how sibling loss is a form of disenfranchised grief?
Sure. I think the harder question to answer would probably be why is it?
Yeah.
Because it doesn't really make a lot of sense. But so my experience in 1999 after my brother died was I went to his celebration of life, and person after person came up to me and said the same thing over and over again, like they were reading from a script or something. They said, "Be strong for your parents."
Yes.
And then I went home and like researched online on the new bookstore, Amazon.com at the time. And there were literally no books. There was one book, but it was out of print on the topic of sibling loss. I've said this before, but there were more books on like losing a pet turtle than on losing an adult brother or sister. So yeah, it doesn't make sense. There's not enough resources, there's not enough books, there's not enough research. And yet a sibling relationship is the longest relationship that
Yes.
we could anticipate having. And in some ways, the most, like, nobody else knows you when you're a child, like sharing
Right.
your parents with the same person. Childhood is almost like its own universe. And losing the person that you shared that experience and that language with, it is significant.
I love how you just said that. Childhood is its own landscape. And this is the only person who's traversed that with you. Yeah. And I think, regardless of what your experience is with your family of origin, having someone else be able to validate it, whether it was really great or it was not great, or just to say, have those secret memories, that time when nobody else knew and, what was going on, you two knew what was going on. That can be so powerful. And yeah, I think I've heard it said that sibling loss is like losing a limb,
Mhm.
one you expect to keep all your life. And of course, when you go through things like this, you don't. And it sounds like in various ways and at various times for all of us, we had this loss, and then we had a different relationship with our siblings. And one of the things that has affected all of us and has changed that relationship that we have with our siblings is writing. So, can you both talk about how writing has changed that relationship, whether it makes it closer, it makes it make more sense? I mean, you decide how you want to talk about it, but tell us how writing has been a part of your healing process and that connection process. And so, because there are two of you, I will manage the room and say, Alyson, you go ahead and start.
I think for me, it's definitely made our relationship more tangible
Mm,
and less just in my mind.
yeah.
And I've talked about this other times, but I've shared about Michael online, and people will say, "I'm sorry for your loss," or whatever, in response to whatever my post is about. And those posts and the sibling loss community that we are a part of and, growing is the most acknowledgement I've ever received for that
Mhm.
loss. And my first instinct is like, "Oh, don't worry about," like to just say like, "Oh, thanks, like he's been dead a long time," it's and I think writing about it and sharing the writing has been a very gentle push into me acknowledging what his loss has meant to my life
Mhm.
and helped me begin to understand what a difference it's made. Because I do think there was a big push to be like, okay, now there's four of us
Yeah.
instead of five, just like, the circle's tighter and okay, move on.
Mhm.
To kind of then reconfigure it to what it was. It was five, and how that makes me feel now, and just also just thinking of him and the memories, like, and taking space to write down the memories and to take it seriously.
Yeah.
I think for me, the writing has helped me take it seriously.
What about you?
For me, my experience was different because I had almost like an urge to start writing letters to my brother, like within days after he died. My mom and I both started doing that. It was really like almost like a compulsion. And what it did a bunch of different things for me. It helped me process my feelings. So I think at that time I didn't really know like how to be with feelings. Honestly, it sounds
Mm,
silly, but I didn't know that. And so to connect, like to sit down and write to my brother, it maintained our connection. It gave
yeah.
me like a chord that went straight to him,
Mm-hmm.
and that allowed the feelings to come out. So
Yes.
that, I would go to that when I would start to feel it like kind of build up in my body, and that like kind of tight, constricted, like, ooh, this doesn't feel good, and go to those letters and just cry and express it. And then the other thing it did that I didn't expect at the time was that it helped me capture memories that I would not otherwise have. There's
Mm-hmm.
something about, at least in my experience of early grief, I would have like these memories would just kind of bubble up to the surface, like
Yes.
breaching memories. And I look back at those letters now and I don't remember the memories, but I
Mm-hmm.
have them still because I did write them down.
I love that practice. It's such a beautiful practice. And, if you're listening and your grief is really young or fresh, and what I often tell people is that it's fresh and it's young for a hell of a lot longer than you think. Like, 1 to 5 years, that is young grief when you've lost a sibling. It doesn't just go away. And it's really important to acknowledge that because society tells you to get over it fast. You got 3 days for the funeral. Okay, we'll give you a month. That means that's what they mean when they say take all the time you need, maybe a month or two. But really, it takes years to figure this out. And what I hear in the two of you, your experiences, for you, Alyson, in your family, everyone just reconfigured as if your brother wasn't there. And so it's like
Mm.
there was this ghost outside of the family picture. In your case, Lynn, you brought him in. You brought your brother in so that he was there and he played this big role. In my family, it was really interesting because I think the way my brother died and perhaps the experiences other family members had had, I felt a little bit more like a ghost in my family, like that my brother played this outsized role in his death. And it was interesting because in life, he was probably the least acknowledged of the three of us. He was the quiet one. He was the one who was always in the background. And then suddenly he's always in the forefront. And I understand why that happens. That pain is really big. So it's interesting how we can each have our own experiences. And I think for me, writing allowed me to get close to my brother in a way that I was not able to do in life just because of variety of different things going on in our relationship. It also helped me get closer to myself,
Mhm.
as a both and experience. And so we've each had a way that writing has helped us navigate the story of our loss and the story of our relationship. And yet writing as practice is often done in a room at a desk by yourself. But that is not always the best way to write. It's also not always the best way to grieve. So the two of you have been working hard to build a community that can support all of the people who are grieving. Can you tell us a little about the community that you've created and how that's going?
Yes. Well, originally, like I said, I met Lynn and I just reached out to her about her writing. And then we started, chatting. And she's been working on an anthology, which she'll talk about. And we decided to work on it together because it's a big lift and it's a tough one to do by yourself.
Yeah.
And then we became connected with Molly Folks, whose mother is Margot Folks, who has created a whole grief community. And she joined me for Where I'm From, and then reached out to me after and said, and her son Jimmy died after a long battle with cancer. And she
Mm.
introduced me to Jimmy's sister Molly. And Molly and I started chatting. And then the three of us started chatting. And I think as we began to connect with each other and then with other siblings like you, like very Ann Pinkerton, various people, we started having conversations and it felt incredibly healing
Yeah.
and validating. And we can't, I mean, Lynn has tried to talk to everyone, everyone who responds to her writing. She does engage with most of them in some way, but that's not, you can't do that forever. There are going to be
Right.
people that you can't actually interact with on a phone call or even in writing. And it's
Mm-hmm.
like, so how do we replicate that or grow this and include more people? And we started talking about a website which Molly designed, and it's beautiful. And we're happy that there's a landing place where people can go to find resources and
Yes.
just be seen.
Mm-hmm.
Because something that came up in those early conversations was the hierarchy of grief, and how oftentimes you will go to a grief community, and siblings are kind of like also rans
Mm-hmm.
in those larger grief communities. And so
Yes.
this is just for siblings. You don't need to qualify your loss. You don't need to say, I know it's not as big of a deal. I think
Mm-hmm.
most siblings I know very quickly, let everyone know that they know that they're not that important.
Yes.
And that their loss is not that important. So it was important to us to create a place that they're number one, that
Mm-hmm.
we're number one. So it has all these resources, and we have a book club that we started in May, and we have another one in August. And so we're going to continue doing that, which is a great way for us to actually see each other on Zoom and interact. And we were trying to think of ways for people to feel engaged. Or no, actually, Jenny Burke suggested having an in memory page
Mm-hmm.
where we can share pictures of our sibling or us with our sibling and just some details about it, because it's really powerful to say their names. And
Absolutely.
and you realize how often you just say, or I just say my brother. I
Yeah.
don't say my brother Michael, because I am trying to make it as small as possible. And so it's just, I think the goal behind it was to create a space where no one needed to be small.
I think that's absolutely
That's right.
beautiful. And it's so important for us to have these spaces where our grief is acknowledged, where we are number one for
Mhm.
once in this experience. And what I love about this community is that it's built on connection. And yes, we are experiencing our grief and we are acknowledging it. We are saying our sibling's name. However, because there's the book club and there are all of these other things, there's like a structure that is different from, say, a grief community. So if you're going, to say Compassionate Friends, which is a great organization, and they do now have a group for sibling loss, which was different. When I first lost my brother in 1997, my mom and dad went to Compassionate Friends and they invited me, and it was filled with a bunch of parents. Lynn, yeah, people are nodding their heads. And I felt like an outcast and like I didn't belong and that actually magnified the fact that my grief didn't matter. But having this structured way to be able to communicate, to say names, all of these different things is such a beautiful thing. And if you're listening and you have lost a sibling, regardless of the amount of time that has passed or how old you are, you could be 89 years old or 100 years old. You just lost your sibling. Contact Lynn and Alyson and add your sibling to the memorial page. Let us say their name and let their name be out there. So that leads me to the anthology, because there's the website, which is gorgeous, yes, and all of the resources. And one of the resources that you are working on, especially you, Lynn, and Alyson, you've been working as support, is this anthology about sibling loss. Can you tell us a little about what you are doing and the goal of this project?
Sure. So the anthology was something I thought about, like even in the early months after my brother died,
Mm-hmm.
and the fact that there weren't resources. So it kind of like lived in my brain for a while, a long while. It's been 25 years. So, and I think I kind of thought somebody else was going to do it at some point along the
Mm-hmm.
way. It sounds that's kind of a lazy answer, but it's the truth. And there's still, there are more resources now, and we're connecting with those, the people that are making those resources, but there's still a lack of it.
Yeah.
And yeah, so having this project with Alyson, I think the word I wrote down is sacred. As the essays have started to roll in, it's this connection, this shared language with
Mm-hmm.
other people that have lost siblings. And it's people with all different experiences, different time frame, unique, different from my loss. different from your losses. And yet, like, there's this shared feeling that it's almost like one of the essays, she was talking about kind of the shared language of being a sibling. And she was talking about how their mom used to make quiches and she was on this quiche streak forever, you know, and how they would laugh about that and share that. And though, like, that's not my story. My mom, I don't think made quiches. I could understand, I could feel that connection and that, like, that shared language. So it's not a replacement for the shared language that we had with our siblings, but it's something kind of adjacent to that. And I've been just incredibly grateful for it. We've also had, you know, we've asked a few people who have higher profiles, like Gregory Orr, who wrote The Blessing. And people always say yes, that they want to include their essays in our anthology. So that has also been very inspiring and reaffirming that, like, okay, we're doing something that is important because these people who have Guggenheim fellowships and, you know, such that they know it's important too.
Yeah. And Gregory Orr is here in Charlottesville, Virginia, because he teaches at UVA. So yeah, great connection. Yeah. And I'm curious to know, are there any themes coming up now that these essays are coming in? Are you noticing any themes or any shorthand that's showing up? And either one of you can answer this question that was surprising, like, oh yeah, look, this is showing up in a lot of different places, or oh yeah, I totally get that. And I never would have thought of it before.
For me, it's not having, I have thought of it because my essay is about it, but I think we've noticed that, especially those of us it's been a long time, this ongoing relationship. It's that pretty much across the board, everyone still feels like they're in relationship with their siblings and that they are a presence in their lives. And I think I kind of like thought, well, maybe I'm just alone in this. I don't know. Maybe this is woo or whatever, you know, but it doesn't seem like it is that. It doesn't seem to matter what your background is or what your faith is, that you're in conversation with your sibling, and that when you're writing about them, they're there, like they're present and feeling seen. And I mean, it helps me when I'm talking about death with my kids, like when they are concerned about what happens next. Like, I don't know what happens next, but all of these people I know it's not nothing. And that helps me.
I love that.
I would say the only other thing that I'm connecting to right now is kind of just the way that grief doesn't really abide by time in a linear way, the way that we want it to, maybe, or the way that our calendars would have us believe. And a number of people have mentioned that in their essays. One was, you know, a woman that lost her sister 50 years ago. And she writes that, like, as she's kind of in the end of her life, it's almost that her sister is more present because she's closer to that time herself and she's reflecting on her life. But yeah, the way that, like, I can go through days and days or weeks or months without having acute grief, and then something happens and it's still, I can go right back to that place of, like, I can't believe that he's really gone.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think just the endurance of grief over time, which is really just, as people say, the endurance of love, you know, it's really the same thing. It's just that person isn't physically present anymore.
Yeah, I love that idea of the endurance of grief as the endurance of love. And isn't it an endurance race? I mean, it's kind of a slow little amble. It's not necessarily a race, but there is an endurance component to it because it doesn't go away. You don't always know when it's going to come. It's not always as acutely painful as it was at the beginning, but there is a relentless nature to it. It shows up when it wants to show up.
And it affects the way you see the world. And I think that's something too, that as we are in conversation with other siblings and each other, you see, like, oh, this is something that it's not unique the way that it changed. You know, I'm just not a person who assumes everything will go well.
Yeah.
And that's okay.
Yeah, I definitely think it does change your worldview because it's been popped. I mean,
Yeah.
we all begin the world with some level of worldview that the world is predictable, the world is safe, that people are predictable, we know what's going to happen. And we all have to have some level of that worldview in order to operate. I
Mhm.
mean, it's just a necessary thing. But when you lose a sibling, especially when you lose a sibling young or in a way that is unexpected or tragic, it shifts that because you might redevelop some semblance of the world is safe enough
Mhm.
or the world is predictable enough in order to keep going. You have to do that work.
Mm.
But there is always this thing in the back of your mind of, well, I also know the worst thing can happen.
Mhm. Yeah, I think the fragility of life is something that I live with. And I think it's a lot of things. It's not just the sibling grief. And I don't think it's a curse. I think it's a blessing. I'm very grateful for the blessings in my life every day and that I'm here
Mhm.
and my loved ones are here and I'm just kind of filled with awe that I mean, I can't believe, and I think this happens with a lot of siblings too, like I can't believe I'm 50 years old. I never thought I would be 50 years old. It's
Yes.
just stunning to me. And I feel that way a lot
Mm.
about my life.
And we are the 50s club.
We are.
Is Alyson, she was inducted first. I was recently inducted, and Lynn, she is on the cusp.
Yes.
Next week. Yeah. Well, by the time this airs, I will
Yes, you'll be
be
well into
almost 50 and a
50.
half.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I don't even want to think about being 50 and a half. Like, let's just say we're 50 and time stops, the end. And then we get to be 50 forever. And that's a great age to be. I
50 and
think
a
so
half.
anyway. Yeah. Just hold on to that and that's it. So I'm going to do a lot for a lot of episodes. I ask people about who they are professionally, in terms of their writing in the opening. I didn't this time because I think the purpose of this episode is different. And it was important to establish who we are as people who've lost siblings. But I want to backtrack and give you both an opportunity to say a little about who you are as writers, because you don't just go to your journals, you are actively writing and publishing your work. So, Alyson, would you like to start?
Sure. I write across all mediums and genres. I've written films, I've made a film, I've written comic books, but about sibling loss, I write essays and I have a memoir that I'm editing right now that is inspired by my Where I'm From poem. And I host Where I'm From on Instagram Live. And by the time this airs, I'll have, I don't know, 160 or 70 guests or something like that. And people come and share their Where I'm From poems inspired by the George Ella Lyon poem. And it's interesting, Lynn, when you said the landscape of childhood and how we don't have that shared language with people like we do with our siblings. I am a person who's always been interested in people's childhoods. And it makes sense that I'm doing this now because every week I get to listen to someone's reflections and also these pieces of themselves that they don't really share anymore. We sort of put our childhoods away.
Yeah.
And that's been a real gift to me to make space for that in my life and to also take my own formative years seriously, which it's another thing I felt like I should let go.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's helped me like, oh no, it's important.
I love that. And also for those of you who are listening and you're like, I want to know more about this Where I'm From poem, I'm going to make sure that the link is in the show notes because you may decide that you want to pitch a poem to
Yes, and
Alyson.
please do. Both Lynn and Lisa have joined me, and as well as many others, and everyone is welcome.
So, Lynn, what about you? Tell us about yourself as a writer.
Sure. I guess I say that I write about the hard things. I write about things that I hope will help people feel less lonely. So for me, that's been sibling loss, depression, anxiety, all kinds of fun mental health challenges, parenting, being a sensitive human in a prickly world. It feels like a prickly world. Yeah, so I've written on Elephant Journal for quite a long time now. That's one of the places where I've written quite a bit.
And their work is equally beautiful. And I'm going to ask you both to pick one essay that you've written that you would like to be in the show notes so that people can get a taste of your writing. So, speaking of writing, because this is a podcast where we talk a lot about it, I'm curious to know, what is your best piece of writing advice that you've ever received?
I love this question, and I was thinking about it. And I would say that early on in my writing life, the best writing advice I received was F quality. Like, just sit down and write. You can revise, you can edit, you just get out of your own way, get your butt in the chair and write. And my writing teacher said, just put that on your like monitor whenever you're doubting yourself. And then in my later life, it was actually in a Where I'm From poem with Janine Ouellette. We were talking about writing, and we were talking about how nothing is wasted.
Yes.
And I think that's another thing to continue to encourage you to write. Nothing's wasted. Doesn't matter if this is published or it all counts.
Mm-hmm.
And it all helps you grow and figure out what you're trying to say. And I think also as I've gotten older, it affects my life
Mm-hmm.
and how I view my experiences, my life, myself.
I love that.
Mine is, so I think I've shared this story with Alyson, but I'm not sure I have with you, Lisa. But this was maybe 6 months after my brother died, and my mom and I were seeing a play in Washington, D.C. And my aunt was a director, theater director for many years there. And she went to school with Paula Vogel, who wrote How I Learned to Drive. So this was a Paula Vogel play. And afterwards we went back and got to say hi to her because she had been generous enough to read some of my writing at an earlier time. And she had also lost a brother. And there was this shared understanding, I felt like, that I talked about a little bit earlier, but just kind of in the air between us. And she said, "Are you writing?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Cling to it."
Nice.
And that meant so much coming from her. I have, yeah.
I think we all have been clinging to it. It's been such an important piece of our lives.
Yeah.
And yet, when it comes to sibling loss, whether you are writing in a journal just for yourself, which I highly recommend you do if you're listening and you're like, oh, I don't want to publish anything, you do not have to. But it is always helpful to write about these things. And yet, writing about grief and the tough stuff is a bit of work. It requires our energy and it can feel depleting. So, how do you nurture your resilience as you do this work as writers and as you build this community?
I make sure to take care of myself. I take walks, I meditate, I try to sleep and eat good food. And I also have realized that I have to take off any real pressure,
Yeah.
like that I need to finish it by this time or submit it this many like I did go through a phase during the pandemic where I wanted to get 100 rejections. That was
Mm-hmm.
something I put in my mind that I wanted to do. So I did that, and I'm grateful I did, and it changed my relationship to rejection. But other than that, I have to give myself a break and know that I want this to be a marathon, not a sprint, and I
Mm-hmm.
don't want to exact too high of a cost from myself.
Yeah.
It's not a cost I'm interested in paying, because this is so important to me. I want it to continue to be a part of my life.
Yeah, I love that. And I'm going to say two things and I'm going to turn it over to you, Lynn. One, I think for many people who are writing about grief, there is a preciousness to the writing process because we get to hold on to the people we love and have lost, and they get to be very alive. And when we send our manuscripts out in the world and we say the end, and the project is over, there is another layer of letting go that has to happen. And so allowing for the amount of time you need to do that work is really important. The other thing I'll say is that, we only get, if we're thinking it from a book perspective, right, we're going to probably only write one book about this experience. So giving yourself time to get it right and really understand what that means for you, how you make sense of it, is so important. And I think that's another reason why it's good to let it be a marathon rather than a sprint, because I know so many writers, whether they're writing about loss or love or anything else, it doesn't matter. They want it to be the sprint because they want to hold the book in their hands. And I get that. I do. I'm a writer myself. We get tired of our projects. We don't want to revise again. And we see all kinds of things happening on social media that can make it feel like the sprint is important, in that we are behind if we have not accomplished this goal. But the reality is, you owe it to yourself, you owe it to your sibling, you owe it to your story to just take the time that it needs. So, Lynn, how are you nurturing your resilience?
That's something I've been working on. For me, it's been a lot of kind of just realization that I need to take care of my nervous system, and that it's
Yeah.
pretty easy to be dysregulated these days at this particular stage of my life and this particular stage of history. So really working on like slowing down, making sure that I take time to do things that are restorative, like
Mm-hmm.
being outside in nature. And then another practice I've started is just kind of savoring, like writing
Mm-hmm.
down these moments with, my kids are 12 and 15 now, and time is going fast with them.
Yes.
And if I don't write it down, it leaves because my brain is almost 50. And I'm pretty sure many of us have less attention span and less kind of capacity to build memories, maybe as we did in earlier times before technology. And maybe because I do write so much about hard stuff and intense stuff, and I'm kind of an intensity junkie. There's something really nice about sitting down and capturing like a moment that my daughter and I went to watch a sunset, or
Nice.
look for the northern lights and didn't find them, but it was fun anyways.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that's really important to have that sense of balance, because many of us are drawn to write about these experiences because they were hard. And so we may feel very connected to the challenging pieces because they feel really big inside us. And so we get going on the writing, but it's the small, wonderful things about life that capturing them and writing about them does help with the nervous system. And I recently read a quote that said, healing happens in slowness. If you keep
Mm.
going or you treat your nervous system in the same way you do in your dysregulated life, you will not heal. So, if we want this to be a healing practice and we want it to be an expansive practice, right? Creativity happens in a space of expansion. We have to learn how to go slow and savor the good stuff. Well, you guys are both doing incredible work individually and together. So, I'm going to ask you first individually, what is the best way for people to follow you online and connect with you? And we'll start with you, Alyson.
I think the best place is my website, AlysonShelton.com, AlysonShelton.com. If you're on Instagram, by Alyson Shelton is also good, because that's where I'm from is. But I also post them to YouTube. And I have a Substack too, where I'm from.
And I love how it all creates a brand, right? We have the name and the brand, something that I think all writers and creatives have to have, and yet we hate to have, but you
Mm,
have it.
yes, and I think it sort of magically happened, which is how you hope it will. Like, you can't I personally can't sit around and think, what's my brand? You
Yeah.
know. But
A
then when
brand
it
will not happen that way.
no, no, it has to happen organically, I think, in order for it to be sustainable.
Absolutely. So, Lynn, individually, what are the best ways for people to connect with you?
Or use social media or email. I do have a website that I believe is not working very well at the moment, but I think we didn't mention our website is lossofalifetime.com.
Mm-hmm.
So that's our sibling loss website, lossofalifetime.com, and meant to kind of acknowledge and affirm the fact that it is significant and it is an important loss. Yeah.
And so if you missed that, all of this will be in the show notes. So fear not, you can connect individually with Alyson or Lynn, or you can connect with the sibling loss community, which I hope that you do all three. Well, it has been an absolute joy and pleasure to spend time with you. I mean, we've had lots of times to spend time together. I can't wait for the day when we're all in the same place,
Mhm.
live, IRL, because most of our interactions have been online. But thank goodness for programs like Zoom. That was one of the great things about the pandemic. We got something like this to help us be able to connect.
Mhm.
And so as we wrap up, I want to just offer one more time to say your sibling's name, hold up your handle or candle, whichever you have. And that is how we will wrap up. And then I will ring the bell. And in advance of our final ceremony, I will say thank you to both of you. So, Joe Cooper, he lived for 20 years.
Michael, he lived to be 25.
And my brother Will was 21.
And I'll ring the bell just in honor of them and all siblings who have lost siblings. We see you, we hear you, we understand your loss, and we hope that you feel held by this space. That's it for today's episode. If you'd like to learn more about Lynn, Alyson, or their Loss of a Lifetime sibling support group, please see the show notes for this episode. If you're learning from or enjoying this podcast, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. It's a free and easy way to support the podcast. You can also get the latest episodes delivered to your inbox by signing up for my Writing Your Resilience newsletter. As a thank you, you'll receive a free copy of A Trauma Survivor's Guide to Writing the Tough Stuff. You can also follow the podcast on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, where you can leave a 5-star review. If you have questions for me, comments about the podcast, or questions or topics you'd like me to consider for the Writing Your Resilience podcast, please leave a comment on YouTube. I read them all, and I'd love to hear from you.